On this edition of the NESN Red Sox podcast, we'll talk to Ian Cundall, Director of Scouting for SoxProspects.com, get his lay of the land when it comes to Boston's farm system.
And we'll give our thoughts on the World Series champion Washington Nationals, as well as the hiring of Chaim Bloom as Chief Baseball Officer for the Red Sox.
Swing and a miss, strike three, it's over. The Red Sox have won the World Championship.
The Red Sox walk it off. Mookie Betts. That ball is gone. The X-Man strikes. What a bullet by Devers.
I'd love to see the exit velocity on that one.
It's time to party.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the NESN Red Sox podcast. I'm Ricky Doyle, joined as always by Dakota Randall. Dakota, season's over.
Thank God. Just kidding. I miss baseball.
Yeah, we got ourselves it should be an eventful offseason, at least in these parts, though. Red Sox facing a lot of unpredictability. Before we get into that,
We should congratulate the Washington Nationals and mention the fact that you predicted it.
Hey.
Anybody who's listened to this podcast consistently knows that, and if any of you are out there that do that, that back at the beginning of the season, Ricky picked the Washington Nationals
Sure did.
in our season preview episode.
over who?
Over the Astros.
Yeah.
You called the World Series. You picked the Twins to win their division. I think you picked the Rays. You got like the whole thing.
I had a
right.
pretty good run.
My big prediction was the Yankees would trade Giancarlo Stanton, so that's how far off I was.
There was a few awards I was close on that didn't quite come to fruition.
Yeah, you nailed that one.
Had Chris Paddock in there with a big season, and he tailed off. But
You did, but
Jack Flaherty, who came on strong at the end.
But you deserved a gloat. That was impressive.
Well, thank you. Like I said, when you're wrong most of the time, you just gotta celebrate the small victories.
Yeah, and the one time you are right, make sure you tweet about it.
What did you think of the World Series in general?
I thought it was an awesome World Series. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I watched every pitch of every game because I didn't. I watched as much as I could. I mean, listen, the games just go so long, it's hard to make it through all of them. But I thought it was a compelling series. I thought the fact that the road team won every single game was fascinating. It was just interesting that there were 7 games in that series, and all 7 times the home fans, the fans that paid to go to those games, went home unhappy. So I just thought that was just interesting that happened. But I mean, it was just fantastic pitching on both sides. Multiple Hall of Fame pitchers in that series.
It felt like the game sort of played out similarly. If you turned it on late, if you joined in the second or third inning, it almost always was 2-1 or something like that. Both starters would figure it out, settle in a little bit, and then it would be close. And a team would pull away late, but the final scores a lot of the time didn't justify how close the games were.
Yeah, and I think, my biggest takeaway from it is just the Nationals had a ton of sack. They were a team, they had a ton of balls on that team. Every time they were in a tough spot where it looked like the Astros were going to come back, even in the games the Nats won, where it looked like the Astros were going to come back and tie it, or they were going to pull ahead early in the game, the Nationals would always fight right back, tie the game, or take the lead. They just came up in so many big spots. Their pitchers came through. And while, last season you had the Red Sox just lead wire to wire, just dominate nonstop, I think this season the Nationals showed that there is something to be said for it. They battled all season. They were, 19-31 at one point. They were the wild card team. They were playing for their lives most of the way.
I mean, there was talk of whether they should
showed in the World
sell
Series
at some point.
Right, yeah, there was talk. They almost sold at the deadline, and it just goes to show, when a team, it's always be fearful of the team that's had to battle for its life for much of the season. And they got in there. They weren't afraid of any spot, and they were awesome. I thought it was cool that they won. It was a nice, unexpected, cool team, a lot of neat players.
Interesting, too, that ultimately at the end of the day, starting pitching was paramount in making it to the World Series and the ability to shift your starters to the bullpen. It's like we've seen this before.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because, on one hand, the Astros are a very analytics-driven team. There's so much now with everybody going with openers and all the stats and all the analytics just bogging down the game. These are 2 teams that prioritize starting pitching that can go deep into games and playing the game the right way. Obviously, both do a lot with analytics, but it was just,
that's the thing.
It was kind of shoving it to the nerds saying, listen, look, guys, starters that go 7 innings, even if they have to go through the third time through the order, that's still the way to do it if you have the guys that can pitch like that. And it was refreshing to see that these 2 teams did it sort of the old-fashioned way, with obviously a lot of analytics sprinkled in. But at their core,
part of the
starting
analytics
pitching
is identifying the starters that are able to to do such things.
Right,
You know
of course.
what I mean?
But I'm just saying, you didn't have too many scenarios like last year where Dave Roberts takes out Rich Hill when he's dealing because he's worried about the third time through the order, and your guy only goes 5 innings. It was like, no, this guy's dealing. Now, in Game 7, maybe that cost A.J. Hinch taking out Zach Greinke. But overall, I just thought it was cool that these were two teams that just had a lot of good starting pitching, and that carried them, and it was refreshing.
Yeah.
As someone that just isn't, I'm sick of all these bullpen games and the openers. They last 5 hours. Let's go the old-fashioned way. But
I agree.
I appreciated it.
Decent World Series all around. Some action on the Red Sox front here in recent days, weeks, whatever, days really. They went out. They hired themselves a new head of baseball operations, chief baseball officer.
Chief baseball officer.
That's the term they're going with. Chaim Bloom.
Not Chaim.
No. You've messed up a few times in the early going, and we're promptly corrected.
Yeah, it's Chaim.
So yeah, and an interesting hire. Seems to be, by all accounts,
former assistant GM with the Rays, right, or whatever that title's called there. That's what he was.
So he comes from the Rays organization, very highly regarded across Major League Baseball. Interesting hire. Obviously, it's tough to slap a grade on it.
Right.
'Cause you don't know. It's tough to figure these things out when it comes to front office moves, and when it's not somebody who's got a very a deep background. I mean, he's still young. He's still 36, I believe.
Right. But I think our podcast guest today, Ian Cundall from Sox Prospects, I thought he had an interesting insight because, admittedly, he probably knows more about Chaim Bloom than we do, and he said, he told us that when the offseason started, when Dombrowski got let go, that Chaim Bloom was one of his top 2 candidates he hoped the Red Sox got. So that's later on in the interview, but I think he had some interesting insights on that hire.
Yeah,
we'll get to that in a minute.
But. The long story short, is just very highly regarded across Major League Baseball.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good thing for the Red Sox.
Yeah, and obviously the hire also reeks of them trying to find the next Theo Epstein, the next boy wonder, which
Perhaps,
it's not a bad thing to aspire to, but...
And I had suggested a few weeks ago when we were settling on potential candidates. Well, not we didn't really spitball potential candidates, but just like it's the philosophical aspect of it, like what type of guy should they be looking for? And I said rather than spend all this time worrying around here about whether Theo Epstein's a guy that you could potentially bring back, why don't you go find the next Theo?
The next one.
Now, whether he's the next Theo, who the hell knows?
You're killing it. You basically called Chaim Bloom. You called the World Series. You called Nathan Eovaldi next year.
I was gonna say, don't rule out.
I know.
I want to know.
But I think this hire really is about 2 things. It's about finding the next Theo or the next boy wonder, whatever that may be, and it is the Red Sox going all in on analytics. So whether or not, regardless of how you feel about that in baseball, that's what this hire is it is the Red Sox doubling down and going all in on analytics because that's what this guy is. That's what he's coming from, and. But it's hard, it's the success of using that approach in baseball is undeniable at this point, despite what I just said about kind of liking the old school style. Right. That's just me, but that's why I'm wrong all the time. These guys know what they're doing, and that's what this is. It is the Red Sox and Alex Cora are going all in on analytics and trying to find the next young guy that knows that style, that strategy better than most of the other guys in the game.
Regardless of who assumed that position, they get a full plate right out of the gate. A lot to figure out with the future of Mookie Betts hanging in the balance. How they're going to tackle this, both the rotation and the bullpen, maybe augment those in some capacity. First domino has already fallen with J.D. Martinez choosing not to opt out of his contract. So as it stands, it's about 3 years, $62.5 million, I believe it is, remaining on that 5-year, $110 million deal. He signed a couple of years ago. So really it's a season-to-season thing with him, but
it also doesn't close the door on, who knows? Just because he did not opt in does not mean necessarily that J.D. Martinez is going to be on the Red Sox.
Could still be a deal.
Year.
Who knows?
You never know. So.
We will have, I'm sure, several Red Sox podcasts throughout the course of the offseason as these things develop. We got the winter meetings. We got the GM meetings coming up, then the winter meetings.
Yeah, we'll pop in and out when those things
popping in and out. But we did want to take a step back and sort of look at the prospect landscape, see how the Red Sox farm system
because it also ties in with the new hire and in the future of the franchise.
Yeah, exactly.
It all ties in with the offseason.
Potential pieces if they were to make some sort of splash. What kind of what we're looking at here from a farm system standpoint. And as such, we decided to turn to Ian Cundall, the Director of Scouting for SoxProspects.com. Ian's been on with us before, provides great insight.
Longtime friend of the podcast.
He is. And so we were able to get him in there, talk about some specific players, and ultimately just, you mentioned the Bloom hiring and how he views that, what that means for the organization as a whole. So just a lot of good insight from Ian as usual. So when we get to that interview,
let's get right to it.
So here he is, Ian Cundall, Director of Scouting for SoxProspects.com. Joined now by Ian Cundall, the Director of Scouting for SoxProspects.com. Ian, how's it going?
Doing good, guys. How you guys doing? And now that we're done with baseball for the year,
Doing well. We got some potential snow on the horizon. Who knows? We get into it's gonna be tough sledding before long here.
Yeah,
it is. But hot stove's gonna be heating up pretty quickly, I have a feeling. So.
Pretty soon. So we'll actually let's get into that a little bit. I'd like to look back first on the 2019 season, and then also we'll sprinkle in a little look ahead. But Dakota, you can jump in really whenever. But I wanted to start at the top really with the what Sox Prospects seems to be the top prospect in the Red Sox system, Triston Casas. I was just wondering really what you make of Casas' first full season in the Red Sox system. Obviously that first year right after being drafted in the first round was derailed by an injury, but obviously it seems like all good things from this past season. So I just want to see if your opinion has changed of him as a prospect at all and what really you've seen in his development thus far.
Yeah, Casas has had a slow start, which is understandable. He's a high school kid going directly to full season ball, but he really picked it up as the season went along and showed kind of what the Red Sox were hoping they would get when they took him in the first round a couple years ago. And that's a guy who can hit, and he can hit for power. He had 20 home runs in Greenville this year, and both between talking to scouts and I was able to see him in both in spring training and after the season, the fall instructional league. The power is legit. It's like easy 70 raw power. Game power plays a little below that, but still, you're talking about a guy who could hit potentially, 30 plus home runs at the major league level at some point. A lot, obviously, that will depend a little bit on what baseball they're using, but that's not something we can really predict right now. I think the things that I liked were he made some adjustments to his swing this year to make a little more contact as the season goes on, and he's kind of a interesting looking guy just because he's really, really tall and has very long arms, and sometimes that can cause his swing to get a little long, but he did a good job shortening it up as the season went on and not really taking away any of his power. So I'm not really concerned about the strikeout rate or anything. He's someone who, both just talking to scouts who saw him this year, they're confident that he's going to hit and he could be a potential masher at first base, in the next couple of years.
I've heard people compare him to Freddie Freeman. Is that fair, or is that a little out of whack in your opinion?
I mean, that's like a best case scenario because obviously Freddie Freeman's one of the top, 2-3 first basemen in all of baseball. But I mean, I like him at first base defensively as well. We didn't really touch on that, but I think he's athletic enough even for his size to play there. He's like 6'5", probably 240 right now. And yeah, I mean, you're talking about a guy potential plus hit tool plus power. That's around 280 to 300 with 30 home runs, and that's maybe a poor man's Freddie Freeman because Freddie Freeman's like 330 with 35, 40 home runs. But yeah, I mean, that's like the ceiling. That's what you can dream on for sure.
Cool. Well, staying with position players, the other one that fans have heard a lot about, of course, is Bobby Dalbec. And John Morosi said the other day that the people around Team USA have been raving about him, and that sort of all comes on the heels of his stint with Pawtucket, in which he was playing really well and got a lot of big reviews. And there's just been a lot of buzz around Bobby Dalbec. People saying his play discipline has gotten much better, just sort of improved as an all-around player. What have you seen from him? What did you see from him this season? Is the hype on Bobby Dalbec? People are talking about him in much more glowing terms than they did this time last year. I'm just wondering if you sort of feel the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's two things need to be looked at. First, offensively, and the strides he's made with cutting down his strikeout rate are very notable. He was previous year he's like around 33-34%, and then this year he cut it all the way down under 25%. And if he can stick around that number with his raw power, he's going to be able to hit enough to be able to hold down probably a starting role for a major league team. My question is, I just need to see the consistency in for him to continue to keep that strikeout rate low for another year, because his career before that is not great in, cutting down on the Ks. So that's kind of the big question. But his approach, I mean, it's still good. He walks a lot. He's always going to get on base. He's not ever going to hit for the highest average, but he's got that OBP slugging combination that you see a lot in major league lineups these days with guys hitting, like in the 6th spot in the lineup. And so I think that it's something that as long as he can keep the Ks down, he's someone I think the Red Sox could potentially be looking at for a big league spot as soon as next year, honestly. The question for me is, though, what position? Because defensively this year at third base, he kind of regressed a little bit from what I saw the previous year. He seemed to bulk up a little bit, and it kind of slowed it down slow down his range and kind of his athleticism at third base. He's still got plenty of arm, obviously, because he was a pitcher back in the day, throwing in the mid-90s. But the question for me now is I think he's ultimately going to probably end up at first base, which isn't the worst thing because the Red Sox already have their third baseman entrenched. So, but they need a first baseman, so it kind of makes it all fits in the end.
Okay.
What about in the outfield? You think they'll experiment with that a little bit? Maybe see if he can play in left field?
I mean, you might maybe try him out there, but I'm not sure he's got the foot speed you want in the outfield. Though I guess in Fenway, because of how small left field is, maybe you could fake it.
Right.
But I think first base is more likely position.
Okay. What about Jarren Duran? I mean, he started last season on fire. He was hitting in the 400s. I think still after the first month, and then once he got moved up to Portland, I think he had a good debut, but then he struggled a lot. He was hitting in the 100s, and then it seemed like water kind of found its level, and he hit around 280 to 300 the rest of the way. So, what was your overall impression with him in terms of what was an up and down season? What's his ceiling? What's his MLB ETA? Are you still as high on him as you were, in the early part of the season?
Yeah, definitely. He's still someone. I think he's like our number 6 prospect at the end of the season rankings. And as you said, he destroyed Salem. He came out and was just on fire. Went up to Portland. Understandably, that's a very significant jump. The high A to double A jump, I would say, is probably one of the most difficult ones, other than obviously jumping to the majors and then maybe you're jumping straight into pro ball. But so he obviously had some struggles up there, but he kind of turned things around. He had a pretty good Arizona Fall League too. Just talking to scouts who saw him out there, they came away pretty impressed. They liked his work ethic. Obviously, he's got the speed. He's solid enough defensively. He'll get on base. He can run. He doesn't have the ceiling of some of the other guys we've talked about. Best case, I think you're looking at maybe someone who hits like near the bottom of the order. Not a lot of power, but plays good defense, can really run, and gets on base. So that's still a very valuable player in this day and age. And yeah, I came away, it's going to be next year. I think he'll probably start in Pawtucket. And obviously, depending on what happens with Jackie Bradley this offseason, there might be an opening in the Red Sox outfield in the foreseeable future that he could be under consideration for.
Okay. Well, staying, on position players that have had a ton of buzz. Last year, I don't know if it was in the off season or before the season. Regardless, we asked you for a prospect who you thought was way off the radar, that if everything went well, if everything clicked, could come on and really generate some hype. And you identified Gilberto Jimenez, and you were right. He had an outstanding season. And
take a victory lap.
Yeah, you sniped that one. Every week it seemed when we were looking at minor league stats and stuff, and he was killing it. I was like, Ian said so. So just what did he show? Was he really that good down there? I know it's in the low level of the minors, but were you really impressed with him?
Yeah, I mean, that Lowell team in general, just looking at it as a whole, was absolutely loaded this year. And he was the standout offensive player by far. His final line, he hit 360, 393, 470 as an 18-year-old facing, mostly college pitching in the Penn League. And you got to consider too, he didn't play stateside last year. He came directly from the DSL, so he skipped over the Gulf Coast League. So that's a pretty significant jump. And I think the thing that stands out obviously the most with him is his speed. Some of the run times you get on him are absolutely insane. He's a true 80 runner. He's easily the fastest guy in the system.
Is he faster than Duran?
Oh yeah, like you think Duran is fast. Gilberto's on another level of fast. And he just he's just one of those guys that's really exciting to play. There's like a different kind of energy when he's at the plate, because when he puts the ball in play, you never know what's going to happen. I've seen him turn like a line drive to center field into a double where he just walked into second base and it was a one hopper to the center fielder. Or I've seen him, he had a triple once that was to left center field that the left fielder cut off about 25 feet in front of the fence and he was just standing on third base. Like, he just does things like that. And when you have that type of speed, obviously the baseball instincts are still on the raw side, the approach is on the raw side, and there's basically no power. But he doesn't really strike out. He puts the ball in play, and he plays to his skill set. And now the question ultimately for me is going to be, will that skill set translate against more advanced pitching? Because he's going to get challenged more by velocity. Guys are just going to be like, all right, you're not going to hit a home run off us. We're just going to bust you upstairs with fastballs and then throw sliders down in the dirt. And ultimately it's on him to make adjustments. But I saw him in the instructional league, and he's already starting to kind of retool his swing a little bit to try and get a little more power and kind of square the ball up more. Keep the barrel in the zone longer, and that's all very encouraging. And just from talking to some people around, he seems like one of those guys who really likes the game, cares for his craft, and there's a lot of upside there. He's a really exciting guy.
What do you think is the best case scenario for him next season? Like, do you think he could make it all the way up to Portland, even though he's so young?
I wouldn't say Portland. I think Salem is the best case. He starts in Greenville, does that for the majority of the year, and then you bump him up to Salem. But I mean, I've talked to some scouts who suggested that they don't think he'll be challenged in Greenville. So I mean, I'm not sure about that, but there's some who think that Salem is really where he's going to start facing those more advanced pitching that will give him some trouble.
Okay.
I did want to transition to pitching, but real quick, I also want to touch on C.J. Chatham, just because it seems like he was another one who sort of, by the end of the season, generated maybe a little bit more buzz than expected, and with some unpredictability in the infield, specifically regards to the first base and second base going into the season. Is he a guy that you could see making the jump to the majors at some point in 2020?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not sure he's someone who will ever play like an everyday role for the Red Sox, but I think he's someone who we could see come in next year as like a Brock Holt replacement, as that super utility bench player who starts 4 games a week. And that's ultimately a valuable guy, because he'll be making a minimum salary, and you'll be replacing Brock Holt, who's probably going to get $6-7 million a year next year, with a guy making $500,000. Yeah. And given the Red Sox apparent budget constraints, they're going to have to make some sacrifices like that. And he's someone who right now he's playing for Team USA along with Beck. He's playing with them. I think he's hitting 9th and playing second base. And then also in the Arizona Fall League, just people came out. He's not the most exciting guy, but he's someone who can hold down a position. It's not going to hurt you, plays really good defense, makes contact. There's no power at all, but he's just a useful player. And I think he kind of gets overshadowed because he doesn't have that ceiling of some of the other guys like the Jimenez, the Dahlbeck, the Casas. But ultimately, he's someone who I wouldn't be surprised if we look back in 7 years and, he's on his 6th year with the Red Sox, entering his final year of arbitration or something. And, he's held down that utility role for all that time. So I think he's definitely got a big league future.
It's interesting that you sort of bring up the payroll constraints with which they'll be working with this offseason, because I think it's certainly interesting as they search for starting pitching, and the fact that they don't really have that, the collection of young starters that they can turn to at the minor league level to sort of fill whatever voids they may have in that rotation. So it seems to stem from just total inability to develop starting pitching for a while now. And I just didn't know if there was anything that you can point to in the developmental process that you think could be maybe a reason for that, or just, I guess in broad terms even, where some of these starters seem to go off the tracks, or just the lack of being able to groom a starting pitcher from start to finish, because right now when you look at the rotation and project out ahead, it doesn't seem to be a lot of arms internally that they can turn to.
Yeah, that's the case. I mean, their top, like the depth of their starting pitching is all in the low minors. It's like that Lowell team from last year, because they had 5 guys at one point in the rotation who I think have the chance to start at some point. The problem is all those guys are 3 years away.
Right.
In the upper minors, there's not a lot. There's Brian Mota maybe, and as you said, this has been an issue for years. And I think it's hard to pinpoint a specific thing. I think a couple factors kind of contributed though. Obviously, the Red Sox don't ever really pick that high in the draft. And if you look, a lot of the top college starting pitching prospects, which are the guys that develop quickly, like the Aaron Nola types, they go in the top 10 picks, and they just don't have a chance to draft those guys.
And they swung and missed on Trey Ball, which was a huge one.
Exactly. And then I was going to go next. The next point was, when they have tried to draft starting pitching, it just hasn't worked. You go back to Trey Ball, Ty Buttrey. Obviously Ty Buttrey's a big leaguer, but he's not a starter.
Jay Groom, obviously.
Yep, Jay Groom, which jury's still out on him, but Pat Light turned into a reliever. Brian Johnson's a fringy guy. It's hard to draft starting pitching. It's not just them, a ton of teams. And then they traded, obviously, Michael Kopech, but
right.
It's just hard to draft starting pitching or find starting pitching. I mean, every team's trying to do it. And I think of late, you've seen kind of a shift in the way the Red Sox have tried to approach it in the draft. I know, in the 2017 draft, they took one starting pitcher, I think, in the first 20 rounds, one true starting pitcher, and that was Alex Scherf, and he's already in the bullpen. And then Tanner Houck was, I guess, a starter, but he's still, jury's out on him. Then similarly in the 2018 draft, they didn't really draft any starting pitchers at all, but they drafted a couple of relievers that they've turned to starting pitchers. Like Thad Ward has really taken a step forward this year, and he's someone now in our top 10 who has a potential to be a starter because he's added a new pitch, athletic guy. And then similarly this year, they went with a lot of guys who this year they kind of swung the pendulum back and started taking some swingman relief types in college, and other than Noah Song, who was a true starter, and turned them into starters, and they had some success there. So it seems like they're trying to focus more on the college pitching and guys that identify guys who maybe fit their analytics or TrackMan data that weren't necessarily used in that role, but could transition to it in pro ball. And I think the returns the last few years have been really starting to show in the system, and it's kind of plugging that gap that exists between, the low minors and the high minors, whereas you alluded to, there's really nothing right now.
Now, it seems like Noah Song is a guy that's getting a lot of play here, and obviously being a 2019 draft pick. You also mentioned Thad Ward. I mean, these are guys that I don't think a lot of casual fans are maybe familiar with going into this offseason, but they've cracked the top 10 on you guys' prospect rankings. So I guess with those two guys specifically, and then sort of what your overall opinion is on sort of the pitching outlook. But I guess we'll start with Song and Ward and just sort of where why they've made the jump into the top 10, what you've seen from them thus far.
And I'll just add into that real quick. A lot of people have heard about the whole Navy background with Noah Song, but I don't think many people totally understand it or understand what's going on. So any insight you can give on that whole aspect of his story?
Yeah. So Noah Song's a really interesting guy because talent-wise, he probably should have gone in like the second round of this year's draft, but he has a 2-year commitment to the Navy, which is supposed to start in November. It was pushed back to December so he could play with Team USA right now in the Olympic qualifying, which is actually kind of important. I'll circle back to that why in a second. So the Red Sox drafted him in the 4th round and gave him a $100,000 bonus, and he came out in Lowell and was just absolutely insane. I saw him up to 98. He's got an improving changeup already, like a 55 to 60 slider, and then he's got a workable curveball. And, that kind of stuff you don't get in the 4th round. But because of this 2-year commitment, where if he has to go serve in the Navy, like he will not play baseball for 2 years, like at all. He will, he'll be in flight school in Pensacola, becoming, I think he's a helicopter pilot or something to do with helicopters.
It's pretty
so
badass.
He'll be doing, yeah, no, it definitely is.
Yeah, you can throw 98, but also fly planes.
Yeah. Well, no, this is funny. I think he wanted to be a fighter pilot or some sort of pilot in jets, I believe, but he was too tall because he's like 6'4".
Oh, so he couldn't
fit.
He
was over the height required. So I think that's why he switched to helicopters, from what I understand. But so anyway,
what am I doing in my life? Jesus.
So anyway, he has to serve in the military for 2 years as of now. However, this summer, the Trump administration Department of Defense announced a plan to reinvestigate and potentially reinstitute an Obama era plan where basically if you have naval service or army service, any academy service, and you can get a waiver if you're an athlete, basically is the general idea.
Okay.
And so that's how like some football players in the past have gotten out, and a couple baseball players have too. And for some reason it lapsed during the Trump administration, but now they're re-looking at it. And I think they had I want to say 100 days from this summer, so at some point in the next month or so, they're supposed to be putting out an announcement about that, of whether it's reinstituted. And if that gets reinstituted, then he probably will be able to get it deferred. And his case will be buoyed by the fact that he's playing for Team USA now, because one of the considerations they look at is they consider like qualifying for the Olympics as like helping your country, or I don't exactly know the details, but basically the qualifier he's playing in right now is for the Olympics, and Olympic athletes are some of the ones who have had a history of being able to get these waivers. So if he can get this waiver, he'll be able to play no issues for the rest of his career. Wow. But we don't know right now if that's going to happen or not. And so as of now, he has to plan on reporting to flight school. And so while his upside, I mean, he's one of the more interesting and like true starting pitching prospects in the system, like our ranking's a hedge because there's a non-zero chance he misses 2 years as well. So it's like a really interesting story. I mean, credit to the Red Sox for taking the risk, because talent-wise, it's an insane value for them, and it's something they needed to do this year, frankly, because they obviously lost 10 picks, and the equivalent bonus amount, I think it was like $600,000, because they were over the luxury tax last year in the draft. So they took some gambles with some guys later, and they can get him in the system for next year. He's someone who I think could move pretty quickly, not necessarily up to the big leagues, but get into the high minors and be someone we could maybe be looking at for the Red Sox rotation for 2021 or 2022. Or alternatively, he could not be pitching for the Red Sox again until 2022. So it's, who knows with him.
That might be the most sneaky, fascinating story in the minors.
The headline, how the Trump administration could help the Red Sox finally develop a pitching prospect.
Imagine the views that would get.
Seriously.
And then on Thad Ward, he's someone who I saw a lot last year with Lowell. He was a 5th-round pick out of UCF. And he was a reliever in college, or like a swingman. He started a few games, and then they moved him to the rotation immediately. And he was pretty good last year with Lowell. And then this year, they worked with him, and he added a new pitch, a cutter. and he's just really taken to that pitch, and it's given him like a true like plus out pitch, which he didn't have before. And so now we're talking about a guy with like a fastball in the, you know, low to mid 90s up to like 96, 97, but mostly like 91, 94. This cutter, and then he's got a slider, a curveball, and a changeup also. So he's just, you know, a nice athletic delivery, good pitcher's frame. And scouts just always came away impressed. And his numbers were really, really good this year. I struck out like 150-something guys in 130 innings across Greenville and Salem. He was really good in Salem after his promotion, and he's someone who I think could actually move pretty quick. I bet he starts in Portland next year, and if he was as good, if he continues pitching like he did this year, I would not rule out seeing him at some point late next year, but probably not in the rotation again, more in a relief role if they're competitive. But he's someone who I think, like Song, if he's able to play, the timeline fits for, you know, maybe 2021, we start talking about him as a rotation candidate.
Okay. Well, I want to stay on pitching for a second. Brian Mota currently is number 2 in your rankings, yet, and I might be wrong here, but it just seems like there's the general vibe around him is people just don't seem to be that optimistic, or they don't really know. They don't know if he's going to be a starter or reliever, how good he really is, despite the lofty, his high spot in so many prospect rankings. What do you feel about Brian Mota? Because it felt like he struggled last year. He took a step back. This year he had a bit of a bounce back. Where do you stand on him as of now?
So yeah, it's a tough one. I saw him this year a few times, and I saw one of his really good start with him in Portland. He had a little trouble in the first inning, then he threw like 6 shutout innings, had 9 strikeouts or something, gave up 1 hit. And you saw like the good Brian Mota, but then there's the bad Brian Mota where he just walks a ton of guys.
Another one of those.
Yeah, the raw stuff is very interesting. He's up to 98, 99 miles an hour. He'll sit 94 to 96. He's got a plus cutter, slider. I think it's a slider, but he calls it a cutter. So it's 86 to 90 miles an hour. That is a legit out pitch. Like, he gets some really bad swings on it. His curveball and changeup, again, seeing a kind of a trend here.
Right.
Average-ish, fringy, but it's a 4-pitch guy. His delivery took a big step forward this year, and I think that was the most important thing because he kind of got in shape. He got a little large last year, I'll say. 2 years ago, excuse me. And I think that impacted his delivery. And this year he came in a lot better shape, cleaned up his mechanics a little bit, and it allowed him to kind of stay on line of the plate and around the zone more. Control is still ahead of command, even though the control is still below average. And I know just talking to scouts, there are some who think he could be like a number 2 starter, but then I'll talk to other guys who think he's a shutdown closer. So kind of the range of outcomes is all over the map here, and ultimately it's going to come down to fastball control. If he throws enough strikes, he's got 4 pitches, he can be a starter, potentially, I think, like a number 3, maybe even a high-end like a low-end number 2 if you want to dream on it. And if not, he's someone, though, that I think safely I'll project as in a back end of a bullpen. And that was kind of the takeaway from the Arizona Fall League. It kind of sums up his experience. He struck out 10 guys in 10 innings, but he walked 11 and gave up 5 hits. So no one could hit him, but he also threw a ton of balls.
Sounds like Darwinson Hernandez.
I was going to say, it sounds like a real wild card element to it, which seems to be a theme with a lot of the guys that have come up in recent years.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
No, I was just going to ask you about Jay Groom, and it seems like he's sort of the same deal where he's coming off what I think would amount to a sort of a lost season, but there's a wild card element there where, you even mentioned it earlier that the jury's still out on him because, there's been limited exposure, but also it's just tough to really get a gauge on everything.
Yeah, I think Groom's issues or the question marks are a little different because Mota's it's a consensus opinion that he's going to be a big leaguer, and there's a very good chance he's like an impact big leaguer even in a bullpen role because his stuff, if he just has to throw his fastball and slider, it's like we saw from Darwinson, it's going to overwhelm hitters. So whereas Groom, he was one of the hardest guys to rank because he's thrown 60 innings in his career and he's entering his 5th season with the organization.
Wow, crazy.
What do you do with a guy like that? You know what I mean? His career high in innings is 55. He didn't pitch in 2018. He pitched 4 innings this year. I saw him this year, and the stuff was, a tick down from where I saw him because, ironically, I was actually at his last start that he got hurt at in spring training a couple years ago. And that was the best I've ever seen him. He was 94 to 96 miles an hour there with a 70 curveball, like a plus curveball and a workable changeup. When I saw him this year, the velocity was down a tick. It was 92 to 94, and the curveball wasn't as crisp, and the changeup was, same thing, average-ish. But the upside is still there. He came into this year, he was in great shape. He rehabbed hard, from what I understand, got back on the mound, and the key for him now is just, can he stay healthy? Because if he can stay healthy, the the tools are all there. He's the quintessential starting pitching prospect. 6'6", 220, 3-pitch mix right now. He'll probably add a cutter at some point. He's got the true out pitch and the curveball, good delivery, loose arm, but it's just staying on the field. And injuries or health, that's just not something that we really can predict.
Yeah, and I mean, when he first got drafted, all the question marks around him were sort of either off the field or personal. People think he wasn't grown up enough. But like you said, he's been with the organization for 5 years now, so you'd like to think maybe some of those issues have gone away, maybe going through this whole process where he's had Tommy John, had to be away from the game, and just naturally getting older. I'd like to think maybe some of those issues have gone by, and now it's really just more about the physical side and the performance and where he can be.
Exactly. I mean, I have not heard anything off the field wise since he joined the organization. And as I said, like this year, after rehabbing an entire year, he was in the best shape I've ever seen him pitching.
Which is a great sign.
Yeah, because in the past when he came in, or when he was drafted, I know that was a concern some amateur scouts I talked to had, was that, you're talking about an 18-year-old who's already 6'6", 220. What is he going to be when he's 20? Right. That's the type of guy that can balloon, because guys just aren't that big when they're his age. But instead, he came in this year and he was absolutely jacked when I saw him with Lowell, and then again in Instructs. So, yeah, I mean, ideally he's going to go to Greenville next year, and hopefully he pitches well there quickly. Then you can get him up to Salem, because I think you have to remember he's still only 21 years old, and he'll pitch all of next year at 21. So it's not like he's, a 23, 24-year-old. He's still a young kid. Right. And so if he can just stay healthy, he could definitely get back on track. And upside-wise, he probably has more upside than Mota in the starting rotation, just because the left-handedness and his curveball is better than any of Mota's secondary pitches. So we'll see with Groom. He's like the ultimate wild card for them.
Okay. Just a couple more. I want to get to Durbin Feldman. This time last year, everybody sort of was penciling him in as the closer of the future. They thought he could come up soon or early in the season, and I mean, he just flat out had a bad season. I think there was a stretch there where he settled down a little bit, but really, if you look at the numbers, it was just a struggle all year long for him. Was it just tougher competition at AA? Was it just, I don't know, like what was it with him? Were people maybe a little too high on him to begin with? Was his stuff not that good? What went on, and is it a cause for alarm, or do you think the Red Sox should still be high on him as a potential closer of the future?
I think that the expectations got a little high. He came out last year and his velocity was down a tick. In the past, I've seen him up to like 98, 90 miles an hour. Last year, he was more like 93 to 95. And I think they were kind of trying to work on some stuff. He wasn't throwing his slider as much. He was kind of working on his curveball, it seemed. So they were kind of like tinkering with his mechanics and with his secondary pitches. And I think kind of just all of that kind of contributed to, just as you said, a down year. I'm not too concerned long term. I'm not sure about the closer of the future label anymore. Which I don't think that's really a fair label to throw on anyone, really, because you don't really, you're not drafting a guy to be a closer of the future. You know what I mean? He's a reliever, he's a starter, and then you figure it out, and then some guys just seize the closer role. Like we saw with Brandon Workman. Workman's been with the team for 4 years, and he seized the closer's role this year. He wasn't drafted to be that. So, I mean, I still think there's a late inning bullpen arm. I just think that the expectations need to be tempered a little bit, because he still does have to work on his command and consistency for sure. But, the raw stuff is still there.
Now, I don't think we've caught up with you since the most recent draft class. So I was just wondering your early impressions of who they drafted last June, and just collectively, and then also if there's one name that sort of stands out to you above the rest that maybe we'll be hearing here in the coming months.
Yeah, who's the next Gilberto Jimenez? To put you on the spot again.
You got a pretty good success rate at this point.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll start with the draft class. I like the draft. I was, as you can kind of, if you go to check out our rankings, I think we have 6 of them in the top 20, maybe? No, 1, 2.
Now, is
3,
that more of a product
5.
of their overall talent level, or where the system was at that point in time?
Where the system was at, but it's actually 5, but they're still they have some really interesting late round finds, and I think you have to put in the context of they had the lowest draft signing pool in MLB history this year because of that penalty we talked about earlier. Right. So they had to get pretty creative, and it wasn't like they could go out and take a bunch of the high upside over slot guys and give them money. So you kind of saw what they did is they went under slot with their first pick in Cameron Cannon, who's shortstop from Arizona. Had a rough year in Lowell, but he's an undersized second baseman now. Can hit a little bit. We'll see what goes with him. Second pick, Matthew Lugo. I like him. He's athletic. He's kind of the upside play of the position players they took early. He was out of Puerto Rico. He can run, projectable frame, quick hands, quick twitch athlete type, just kind of the projectable high school infielder that teams like to take. We'll see what happens with him. He's got a long way to go developmentally, but there's definitely some raw tools there. Where the depth in this class was the pitching. We talked about Noah Song pretty extensively earlier. He was their 4th round pick, but in the same range of our rankings, they took Ryan Zefferjohn in the 3rd round out of Kansas, and he's the number 11 prospect for us right now. And he's your prototypical 6'5", 225 pitcher, 4-pitch guy. Changeup really improved this year with Lowell. That's a trend you'll notice with a bunch of these guys, because the Lowell pitching coach is or the Lowell staff seems to be really good at working with changeups. But he's up to 98, 93 to 95 mostly, slider, changeup, curveball. Big guy, some relief question marks, but threw really well with Lowell. So he was an exciting guy. And then similarly, Chris Murphy was their 6th round pick, and he actually probably had the best statistical season of any pitcher they drafted. He had 23 hits in 33 innings and only 4 runs. Had 34 strikeouts. Left-hander, there's not a lot of upside. He's more back-end type, but again, 4-pitch guy, up to 95. And they really just restocked the system with depth. They took a lot of college guys because they didn't have a lot of money to work with. They only took a couple high school guys that they gave over slot to, and with that, that's kind of where it's not a great system. It's still one of the bottom 10 systems in the league, but I don't think it's the worst system like it was entering the season. And that's obviously, it's on its way up. There's room for improvement now, and they definitely have a lot more interesting guys for going forward.
Okay, so Ryan Zefferjohn and Chris Murphy, we're going to hold you to those.
I got a name for you. Sorry.
Okay. Those weren't them. Okay.
No, that was the draft class.
Oh, okay.
For the under-the-radar names to watch, I think one guy to keep an eye on is Jorge Rodriguez. He's our number 23 prospect right now. He's someone who went out in the Gulf Coast League this year and struck out 58 guys in 47 innings and walked 9 people, which seems good.
Yeah, it seems pretty
not
decent.
bad.
But he's a 19-year-old now. They signed him out of Mexico, pitched this year at 18, and he's just very hard to hit. His fastball, he's up to 92 right now, curveball, changeup, and he's smaller side. He's only 5'11", but he's just an interesting guy and someone that people I've talked to have really been impressed with. And then I think position players, it's a little tougher. The depth of the system really is in the pitching, especially when you get to the 20 to 40 range. But someone this is way down there just to keep an eye on, I think, is someone like Eduardo Lopez. He was their big money Latin American signing a couple years ago. In 2018, they gave him $1.1 million or $1.15 million. And he had a solid year in the DSL. Only hit 255, but I just saw him a little bit in Instructs, and he's athletic, projectable frame, doesn't strike out, which I like, gets on base, and he's someone who I think could make the transition stateside this year. And if he shows out what his tools, what the potential of his tools, and starts to translate that on-field performance, he's someone who could rise up the rankings pretty quickly.
Okay, we'll definitely keep our eyes on those guys.
Dakota's writing the names down right now as we speak, scrolling through, writing them down.
Last question. Listen, none of us really know anything about Chaim Bloom. I still really can't pronounce his name right. But
that has been a struggle for me.
Again, anybody that's probably trying to predict this guy or say too much about him is probably just, throwing stuff against the wall. But, for someone like you who does it, who obviously knows a lot more about the system and a lot of this stuff than the rest of us, just what were your initial impressions or thoughts, or just how you reacted to the Chaim Bloom news? Either favorably or negatively, just what you think about the hiring.
It seems like it's a slam dunk. It's what it's made out to be. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. Actually, it was funny when Dave Nabrowski was initially let go. We talked about on our podcast, and then I was asked by a few other people who I would target. And outside the system, my list was I'd want one of the 2 Rays guys, which was either him or Eric Neander, the GM. And that was kind of my pipe dream scenario, but. Right. It worked out that way, and as you said, I think it's a home run. they had to do something different. They needed a new voice at the top, and I think the key for me is that he's creative. We saw with what the Rays have been able to do. They've been able to develop one of the top farm systems in the game while being competitive, while developing starting pitching and opening pitching and relief pitching. And they do it without having this huge budget. They do it by smart trades. They go out and get smart free agent signings. And they're not competing, with the Red Sox for those top big money free agent guys. They're going out and getting Charlie Morton and giving him, 3 years, $50 million or something, or 2 years, $35 million, whatever it was. But, they're finding guys that are undervalued by their organizations and putting them in a position to succeed. And I think that's an area where the Red Sox have struggled in the past. They were really good with it. You think about going back to David Ortiz, guys like that, where they would Kevin Millar. Remember that team, the 03 team,
right?
Where they go out and find these guys on the scrap heap and turn them into usable big league players. And it seems like the Red Sox have kind of got away from that and turning more into, we're going to give a bunch of guys a ton of money, and then the rest of the team will figure it out. We'll just fill it out with a bunch of random guys and see if anyone clicks. And those guys really haven't clicked, and that's put them in the position they're in right now, where they're going to have to cut payroll. They're going to have to make some tough decisions. And Bloom's someone who I think has that kind of creativity and outside the box thinking to put them on the right path forward. And, the farm system has taken some steps forward and has started to move in the right direction. And he's someone who I think will come in and continue and help that grow. And ultimately, with what it seems like the new business model is the Red Sox, the only way that's going to work sustainably with the high-end talent they need to have in order to be able to compete is by bringing up and having guys, a constant flow of prospects coming in making minimum salary for 3 years. And I think Bloom's someone who can really help in that regards, either whether it be through trades, if they decide to go with, the potential big moves that could be on the horizon, or through some of the more creative trades that the Rays used to make. The Rays will do those prospect for prospect trades that we just don't see the Red Sox do. The Red Sox have some depth in some areas. They don't have depth in other areas. Maybe you go out and trade one of those prospects, you have depth for another guy. Things like that, I think, are something that is now on the table, whereas if it had continued with the status quo, that's not something we could really think about.
Yeah, so it seems like what you're saying, and is kind of how I was looking at it, was that, Dombrowski was known to come in and make the splashy move. And we've even talked about it in the past, how in a few instances, the last piece of a trade could ultimately come back to bite them to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
Is, these guys that are more viewed as throw-ins at the time end up becoming impact major leaguers. So with a guy like Bloom,
Logan Allen, yep.
Yeah. So with a guy like Bloom, what you're saying is there might be an instance where he's less likely to maybe include somebody like that, and his impact will really be seen sort of at the bottom of the roster, where these, where he's able to bring in these short money relievers and able to draft these guys that ultimately make maybe a minimal impact at the major league level. Just beyond the top level guys that we were accustomed to seeing Dave Dombrowski.
And on that same side, or on the other end, identifying those guys who other teams might view as throw-ins, but he looks at and says, that's somebody they should value much higher.
Well, exactly, because you look at the Rays roster construction this year, their team legitimately went 25 deep. They didn't care. Their bench players could start for them. They were platooning, G-Man Choi and someone else at first base. They were throwing, Daniel Robertson in there. Just guys that shouldn't be successful big leaguers, but they were. And that's what happens when you have a team where they put everyone in a position to succeed. Another great example, Jalen Beeks. Jalen Beeks with the Red Sox. He was traded for Eovaldi last year. Obviously worked out great. Red Sox won the World Series. Rays turned Jalen Beeks into, I think he was a one-WAR player this year. So he's worth a win. And he was a guy who, for the Red Sox, would he have ever been given a chance to be an opener or a starter? Probably not.
Right.
And the Rays turned him into a guy, I think he threw 100+ innings this year. It's a combination of using the most of what you getting the most out of what you have, and then, as you said, finding those other guys and identifying areas that are undervalued by other teams that you can take advantage of and get the most out of from them. And I think that's something that the Red Sox, they've more focused on. We've got our stars, and if they need to perform, and you saw it this year, if the stars don't perform, the Red Sox aren't going to succeed. Whereas if the Rays, it's more a balanced approach. They can make up for if one of their star players, quote unquote, is having a down year or gets injured. They can compensate for that because they have that depth or that other guy ready to step up.
Sounds like the Patriots model.
You took the words right out of my mouth. It seems very Patriots-esque, to be honest with you.
Is that a bad thing, though?
No, not at all. Right.
Whatever works.
Exactly.
All right. Ian, we'll let you go, but I'm sure we'll try and catch up with you at some point this offseason, because it seems like this is going to be much more eventful than last winter. We could have some moving parts there. We could have some fresh faces in and whatnot. So if they, could have a prospect haul as well. We'll see what happens there.
That's true.
You never know. Yeah, you never know.
All right, that was Ian Cundall, the Director of Scouting for SoxProspects.com. Ian, we'll talk to you.
All right, thanks, guys.
Where can people find you on Twitter real quick?
They can follow me at Ian Cundall, IANCUNDALL, and then you can follow all the stuff from the offseason, all the stuff we're putting out at Sox Prospects, which is our site's official Twitter account.
Perfect.
At Sox Prospects, SoxProspects.com. It's a mouthful. I can't get it out. And at Ian Cundall. Go follow.
All right, cool. Thanks, Ian. Appreciate it.
And welcome back. That was Ian Cundall, Director of Scouting for SoxProspects.com, giving you some insight on just several farmhands and how they progressed throughout the 2019 season, what lies ahead for them in 2020, and so on and so forth. I thought a lot of great points there, though.
Yeah, a lot of great points. He always provides great insight. And again, anybody that is interested in that type of content and gets really nerdy for Red Sox prospects and everything, they do some great content on that website. A lot of people go to MLB Pipeline, but I don't think they don't go nearly as in depth there. You get some rankings and some blurbs, but I think Ian and his staff over there do a great job, really in depth with a lot more prospects, a lot more information on a lot of these players than you can find anywhere else. So yeah, check that out, and yeah, it was great talking to you.
As we mentioned too at the top, I think it's a pretty good time to sort of brush up on that too, some of the developments from last season and what lies ahead, because this offseason, I mean, who knows how these in going into next season, how some of these prospects are going to fit into the overall picture.
Right, and who knows? I mean, some of these guys we talked about could be dealt into the offseason, maybe not.
Who knows?
Regardless, I think the overall takeaway is, and Ian said at the end, this is still probably a bottom 10 system, but it's not dead last like it was a few years ago, and the arrow's pointed up. Just a slight up. It's not straight up, but
it's a ramp. It's like a yeah.
I think it's been a strong 2 years for them in terms of just generating some guys you might be excited about. Somebody like Noah Song, a few prospects you can sink your teeth into. Whereas a couple years ago it was barren because you emptied the cupboard to get the World Series. So now you've reset, and it looks like it's going well so far. So
all right, well, we'll get out of here. We will, as I said before, throughout the offseason, check in every now and then with some of the burning questions, because it will be should be a far more eventful offseason than last winter, after they pretty much stood pat after the World Series.
Real quick before we get out of here,
sure.
Buster Olney said that he would bet his family farm. I don't even know if he has a family farm. Doesn't strike me as a farm guy. Either way, he said he would bet his family farm that Rich Hill comes back to the Red Sox this offseason. Rich Hill is from the area, lives nearby in the offseason.
Yep.
He's 39. He's been hurt a little bit, but he's a really great pitcher when he is healthy. Just what do you think?
I think he's a very viable candidate.
Yeah,
I think it makes sense,
especially with the right price. I think that's exactly.
That's the type of guy you're looking for. I mean, there's been some speculation as to, I think it's like 1 year, $6 million was sort of the baseline contract that was like kicked around as what you could expect him to sign.
Also, got to believe someone like that could easily serve as in a bullpen role too if the situation called for it, if the rotation's packed and you have him on the roster.
Yeah.
And I just think that you can never have too many arms that are capable starters.
And you're
especially left-handed.
You're going to round out. You got to replace the innings from Rick Porcello. I mean, but the thing with Hill obviously is the health, whether that's going to be there throughout the course of an entire season.
The good thing with him is it's never been, as far as I know, at least recently, it's never been anything like overly serious. It's not like he's had Tommy John recently. It's always like a blister or something like that. So I think the arm is in good shape. It's just, he gets banged up a little bit. But
so I don't know if it's Rich Hill, but you're going to see a guy like that probably brought in. If I was to guess, who knows?
Yeah, agreed. But I think that would be a good play. I'd like to see that. So anyway, that's all I got.
Anyways, all right, now let's get out of here. For Dakota
good.
Randall, I'm Ricky Doyle. Thanks again to Ian Cundall, Director of Scouting for SoxProspects.com.
At Dak Randall on Twitter.
Oh, sure. At the Ricky Doyle. I'll continue to make predictions that hopefully will come true, and we'll disregard the wrong ones.
All right, sounds good.
All right, see you guys.